Hello, I'm Lucy Hockings in the Qatari capital, Doha. It is day 45 of the US-Israel war with Iran, and over the next 15 minutes or so, we'll bring you up to date with the latest developments and what they could mean for the conflict. So let's start with some of the main developments today. President Trump has threatened to eliminate Iranian attack ships approaching his blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz.
We can't let a country blackmail or extort the world, because that's what they're doing. They're really blackmailing the world. We're not going to let that happen.
The failure of peace talks over the weekend has caused another surge in oil prices as Iran calls the blockade piracy and threatens to retaliate. The Israeli Prime Minister says he supports President Trump's blockade. Officials from Israel and Lebanon preparing to hold direct talks in Washington. And Pope Leo says he will continue to speak out against the war after fierce criticism from Donald Trump. A US blockade of the Iranian coastline has come into force after the failure of peace talks between the US and Iran at the weekend. The US says all vessels will be subject to interception, diversion and capture, except those transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. The strait, to remind you, is a critical shipping route through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and natural liquefied gas is transported, as well as other key goods such as jet fuel and fertilizer. Shortly after the blockade began, President Trump took to Truth Social, and this is what he posted. He called a warning for fast attack Iranian vessels, writing, if any of these ships come anywhere close to our blockade, they will be immediately eliminated. Well, before we discuss all of this further, we thought it would be useful to give you an idea of just how many Iranian ports there are in the area. You can see here Karg Island, which we've already heard a lot about during the war, but there are a number of others dotted all along the coast, including Chabaha in the Gulf of Oman. Moving up into the Strait of Hormuz, you have Bandar Abbas there, as you can see, and many more along the coast, including Lavan, Imam Khomeini, and Khorramshahr. Well, President Trump was asked about the blockade a short time ago. Let's have a listen.
Mr. President, as far as the naval blockade is concerned, what's the end game? Is it to force Iran back to the negotiating table? Is it to open up the strait so that gas prices ultimately come down?
Maybe everything. I mean, both of those things, certainly, and more. We can't let a country blackmail or extort the world, because that's what they're doing. They're really blackmailing the world. We're not going to let that happen.
So what is Donald Trump hoping to achieve from the blockade? What are the risks as well? Ben Chu from BBC Verify has been taking a look.
Donald Trump's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz has begun, and this is the picture of the strait using live ship tracking information shortly after the blockade was imposed. And unsurprisingly, it's showing not much moving through. Now, the US military has clarified the blockade will apply only to vessels going to or from Iranian ports. So what's it intended to achieve? Well, let's look at some context. This shows the number of vessels passing through the strait each day since the war began. And you can see a pickup since the ceasefire was announced on the 8th of April. Now, the red bars here show Iranian-linked vessels as identified by BBC Verify. Now, this is approximate. There might be some Iranian-linked vessels not identified, and some ships turn off their tracking data. However, you can see that Iranian-linked vessels clearly account for a considerable share of the vessels making the crossing. Now, shipping of oil from Gulf nations such as Iraq and Kuwait has collapsed since the war began, as Iran has effectively closed the strait to them through threats. But Tehran has continued to allow ships carrying its own cargo through the waterway. Since the 1st of March, Iran has been able to ship around 58.7 million barrels of crude, so around 1.5 million barrels a day. And analysts estimate that those oil sales have been earning the regime in Tehran around $139 million a day. And it's this source of earnings which Donald Trump is hoping to cut off to put pressure on Iran. Though it's worth noting that 90% of Iranian oil goes to China. On the one hand, this could induce Beijing itself to put pressure on Iran to negotiate and fully open the strait. But there are risks. Will the US seize or blockade Chinese tankers carrying Iranian oil, some of which have crossed the strait since the war began? And will the US Navy be able to accurately identify vessels that have been to Iranian ports? And will non-Iranian vessels, which the US wants to cross, be willing to travel through while this blockade is in place? There's also a clear risk to global oil prices. Earlier in this conflict, the US lifted sanctions on Iranian oil to try to keep down global oil prices. If this blockade is successful in removing 1.5 million barrels per day of Iranian oil from the global market, on top of the roughly 8 million barrels per day that have been lost due to the collapse in traffic through the Hormuz Strait, then the global oil supply crunch will deepen. That's why global oil prices jumped back above $100 after Trump announced the blockade at the weekend. And analysts say it could easily go higher, especially if Iran retaliates by resuming strikes on Gulf oil production facilities. So while Trump hopes the blockade will put pressure on Iran, there are clearly big escalation dangers too.
So how exactly will the blockade work? Well, let's talk to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, who joins us. Frank, I appreciate there's a lot that we still don't know, and we're learning more as the hours go by. But take us through the logistics of this.
Sure. Well, this is an extreme measure that is a reaction to another extreme measure, Iran's partial blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. What the US is doing is not blockading the Strait of Hormuz per se, even though it may have that ultimate effect. It's blockading Iran's ports. And you saw from the map there, all up and down, Iran has by far and away the largest coastline of any Gulf state, far bigger even than Saudi Arabia. And that coastline extends all the way out into the Arabian Sea. Down there on the bottom right, you can see the red and green dots of ships that are stuck both sides of it, of the Strait of Hormuz, which is the narrow bit. And how will this work in practice is that the US, I think, will be hoping, according to serving and former naval officers, to do a kind of repeat of what it did off Venezuela last year. Namely, it'll be boarding ships or diverting them, forcing them to stop. Quite difficult in the terms of a tanker, because they often take about 3 miles, 5 kilometers to stop or turn around. But they will be looking to drop troops, Marines by helicopter, that kind of thing. If any ship decides to run that gauntlet. Now, Iran has said that this is an act of, or this threat is maritime piracy. The same charge has been leveled at Iran for trying to choke off the Strait of Hormuz. Basically, it's a standoff. Iran doesn't have a conventional navy in the normal sense. Donald Trump likes to boast that they've destroyed Iran's navy, which is largely true, but Iran only has to have some special operations capability, namely a couple of torpedo boats tucked away in an inlet somewhere, a few drones. They're very easy to manufacture. You know, even some Chinese-made tiny little commercial drones packed with C4 explosive to be able to slam into the side of a tanker to make it too dangerous for ships to transit that strait. So it's a real standoff, this, between Iran and the US. Hidden in the shadows is going to be, I think, the presence of China and, to a lesser extent, Russia. China is a big customer for Iran's oil. It gets about 16% of its oil needs from Iran, and 90% of Iran's oil goes to China. So they've both got a vested interest in this not happening. And it's kind of a case of who blinks first. Timing is also very important here, because Iran has so far played a weak military hand very cleverly. They know that they've got geography on their side, that by closing off or partially closing off the Strait of Hormuz in the way they've done, it's driven up oil prices. That in turn is putting pressure on the US government to do something about this. Donald Trump, rather than agreeing to Iran's terms in Islamabad a couple of days ago, he's doubling down and trying to put yet more pressure on Iran, hoping that Iran blinks first. I wouldn't bet on that.
Always great to get your analysis. Frank, thank you so much. Well, there is also now concern of a deepening global energy crisis with the blockade on such a key shipping route. But how have the markets been reacting? And what is the feeling out there when it comes to the energy markets as well? Well, our business editor, Simon Jack, has this assessment of the economic impact.
Well, as you say, it's an absolutely crucial artery to the entire world economy. And if you have it blocked, the entire body of the world economy begins to show trauma. What I think is very interesting about today is actually, given the ratcheting up of rhetoric and a new blockade, markets haven't moved that much. Yes, oil is back above $100, but it's well off the highs that we saw in the middle of last week before the ceasefire and the supposed opening of the Straits was declared. And I think, talking to market participants, I'm hearing that there's actually a bit of headline fatigue around this. You know, you get a social post and then you get another one. How is this blockade going to work? Are they really going to intercept Iranian oil ships, Chinese ships with Iranian oil going to China? What kind of diplomatic incident will that provoke? Is that piracy by legal definition? And I think it's crucial to remember China in all this, because Iranian oil exports, 90% of them go to China, and China gets about 15% of its oil imports from Iran. And now China has lots of other sources of oil, including Russian, but it's not insignificant if you add Venezuela into that as well. And I think this is in some ways a power play to bring China into this, to get them, to put pressure on them, to put pressure on Iran to come to a deal. And other traders I've spoken to said, listen, at the moment, this ceasefire, is still holding. So, and people are talking about a deal, and that's enough to keep markets. In fact, stock markets in the US are actually up today. But as you say, other things, aluminium, helium, feedstock for fertilizer, all that goes through. So all it will take is, one mistake here, one stray missile, one stray tweet, one diplomatic incident, one geopolitical military incident could escalate. So things, the stakes are very high. But I think the interesting thing is that the markets are not freaking out at this latest development today.
Well, and amongst all the other diplomacy that was going on over the weekend, there has been a war of words between President Trump and the Pope. Pope Leo saying he has no intention of debating with Donald Trump after the US president launched a scathing attack on the pontiff. The president also posting and then later deleting an astonishing image of him as Jesus healing the sick, which of course millions of Christians will find offensive. Mr. Trump addressed the post when talking to journalists at the White House.
I did post it, and I thought it was me as a doctor, and had to do with Red Cross as a Red Cross worker there, which we support. And only the fake news could come up with that one. So I just heard about it, and I said, how did they come up with that? It's supposed to be me as a doctor.
This is what Pope Leo had to say. He's been talking to journalists as well on a flight to Algeria. He's on a big tour, a 10-day tour of Africa right now.
I do not look at my role as being political or politician. I don't want to get into a debate with him. I don't think that the message of the gospel is meant to be abused in the way that some people are doing. And I will continue to speak out loudly against war, looking to promote peace, promoting dialogue and multilateral relationships among the states, to look for just solutions to problems. Too many people are suffering in the world today. Too many innocent people are being killed. And I think someone has to stand up and say, there's a better way to do this.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he supports President Trump's blockade, also telling a cabinet meeting that Israeli forces were now operating deeper inside southern Lebanon. According to the latest figures from Lebanon's public health ministry, 2,089 people have been killed in the country since March the 2nd. This comes as officials from Israel and Lebanon are preparing for direct talks in the US on Tuesday. Let's take you live to Jerusalem. We can join our senior international reporter there, Joel Gunter. Joel, just how significant will this moment be when the two sides talk, and what are the expectations?
Well, there is some significance, of course, because these are two nations without any formal diplomatic ties. It is extremely rare for them to be holding direct talks. But these are happening at a relatively low level between the countries' respective ambassadors to Washington, D.C. As for what we can expect, to be quite frank at this point, not very much. At the moment, the two sides are still far apart on a key issue. Lebanese officials saying that they expect to be discussing a ceasefire. Israeli officials have made it abundantly clear that they have no plans to commit to a ceasefire with Hezbollah, the militant group they're fighting in Lebanon, and officials from Hezbollah also say that they have no plans to engage in talks without a ceasefire. So there is still a clear impasse there which could continue to overshadow the peace process between the US and Iran. Israel has scaled back its attacks in Lebanon somewhat under pressure from the US, focusing on the south rather than striking Beirut. And we may see that scaling back continue or persist. But there is certainly no resolution there, a lot of fatigue in Israel, and that front, if you like, for Israel could continue to overshadow that other peace process between the US and Iran.
Joel, thank you. Let's take you inside Iran now. Get a sense of what the reaction has been in Iran to the US blockade and whether there are hopes there of more diplomacy. Joining me now is Siavash Ardalan, who is a senior reporter for BBC Persian. Siavash, what is the rhetoric? What are we hearing from the regime about this US blockade?
Well, shortly after the blockade was announced by CENTCOM, Iran's Revolutionary Guards issued a statement saying that if Iranian ports won't have any security, then no ports in the region will have security. And hint or indication that Iran perhaps may intend to jeopardize or challenge the security of other ports in the region, but no concrete reaction yet. We haven't had any reports of interceptions by U.S. Navy of ships going to Iranian ports or leaving them. When that happens, we have to see how Iranians will react. It all depends on how serious the U.S. is. I guess for Iranians, it's a wait and see game to see whether the U.S. will devote its resources to really block every single ship that goes to the ports. Don't forget, Iran exports not just oil and gas, but it exports petrochemicals and other goods to other countries as well, constituting about $100 billion of annual revenue trade. So it really will bite into the Iranian economy. But at the same time, if Iran keeps the strait closed, it will hurt the global economy as well. So it becomes a test of endurance. How long can the Iranian economy withstand against the global economy? If Iran cannot export its oil, well, the first problem, other than losing a lot of its income, would be its storage capacity. It loses its storage capacity after 2 weeks, and then it can't produce any more oil, and that will hurt its industrial capacity to produce further oil in the future. So it's a very challenging game. Iran has three options: either do nothing and keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, confront the U.S. Navy directly, which could escalate very quickly, or somehow hit back at other ports in the region, which they've been talking about.
Siavash, thank you. Always invaluable to talk to our colleagues from BBC Persian. Thank you so much. Whether you are joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or TV, thanks for your time today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.